Morning. Actually, we have people from all over the world, so afternoon, evening, night. Welcome to our first developer community meetup for 2023. For those who are new to our developer community meetups, these are technical-oriented sessions, less business, more technical for those of us who likes to be hands-on, showing us how to use the product and how to leverage the functionality. Our first topic for this year is a module called Graphit. For those who are new to Graphit, simply put, Graphit is a module that allows you to design, build, configure, and expose web services in a very efficient way, in a business-oriented way, with little to no code at all, mostly drag and drop in definition. Now, we have a lot on our agenda today. If you're new to these developer community meetings, these are designed to be open discussions. You might even notice that you can unmute yourself or share video. We encourage people to participate and to ask questions. I will not go through the items in the agenda now. It will be much more beneficial to actually see it in action, but again, fairly large agenda for us today. I know some of you guys are new to K2view. You might not have been introduced to it. And we're not going to spend time on introducing K2view. Again, this is a developer community meetup. We're here to see the product live. In fact, this is probably the last slide that we're going to review today before we jump and show the product live. But for those who are new, who do not know K2view, K2view has a data management platform. It's essentially a platform that sits on top of all the complexity that is your IT, all the different vendors and applications and technologies and formats. And it knows very efficiently how to aggregate and collect all this information and creates a layer that is essentially a one-stop shop for anybody in the organization that needs data. Any consumer or consuming application that wants data know that they can go into K2view and say, I want this data. Now, there are a lot of integration products out there. And naturally, K2view differentiates itself in quite a few ways. Two of them are the fact that we aim at exposing the data in business context. So instead of the consumer needing to understand the complexity and the structure of the source systems and the application, understand the tables and how they relate and connect to one another, when we collect all this information, we create a business view on top of that data. And we enable the consumer to come in and say, I want a customer. And all of the complication of what is the customer across all these systems and vendor and application, and how we integrate them, and how we transform all the values so they have business meaning, K2view takes care of it in our data management platform. So the first differentiator is the fact that you can interact with the system in a business way. I want a customer versus I want a table. The second differentiator is the fact that this system is aimed at serving both analytic and operational use cases. And that means that when you interact with the data, not only do you get fresh data, but you get the response back in sub-second performance. So applicable for all these operational use cases where when you query the information, when you ask K2view for data, you get it back in sub-second performance so you can cater to your customer and provide better customer experience. Now we do this by manifesting the data in business terms, something that we call the logical unit. So if a consumer wants customer information, in our example, our platform knows how to collect all the data related to that customer across the different vendors and applications and technologies and integrate it and transform it to a business language so the consumer can ask for that one customer. We naturally take care of syncing this information. So when you ask for it and you get the response back in sub-second performance, you get fresh, up-to-date information. We also know to deliver it to consumer applications if that's applicable. And for the context of our session, we also expose the data. So the consumer can come in and say, give me the information about a customer. And the most common way to expose data is by offering web services on top of the platform. And this is where Graphit comes in. Again, Graphit is a graphical designer for creation of web services. What you're seeing right now on the screen, this is our designer. We call it the studio. This is where the hands-on folks do everything from defining how we connect to the source system, how we extract the data, how we synchronize, how we transform and aggregate and cleanse and governs and validate and mask, and everything that you want to do on data, including how we expose it, in our case, using web services. Now, for those who are used to work on our desktop version, that is still here. Nothing had changed. The desktop version is still around. We're still offering both of them in parallel. All the functionality that exists in the desktop version also exists in the web version. So we're going to showcase the web today, but know that every functionality that I'm showing you also exists in your desktop version. And it looks and feels very, very similar, but you'll see that the web version has some features that aim at making the developer or the implementer experience a little bit better. Now, the environment that I'm working on right now, this is part of our product tool environment. In fact, each and every one of you have access to such an environment simply by going to K2view.com. And if you scroll down just a little bit, you'll see here that there is a button to start a product tool. You'll register. The system will automatically bring up an environment exactly like the one I'm working on right now that will allow you to play with the environment. But most importantly, it also provides guidance on how to use the environment. So there's step-by-step guidance. Click here, do this, do that, an introduction to how to use the product. In fact, there is one specific for Graphit as well, which is what we're learning on today. So we recommend and encourage you guys to go to our website and register to this free product tool that will introduce you to how to use our platform and our product. While we're on our website, I'll also remind everyone that through the resources, you can go to our dedicated community portal where you can see previous webinars. You can see spotlights about new functionality and releases that are coming up. You can subscribe to emails from our product team about new functionality that is being introduced. And most importantly, you can ask questions in the Q&A section. This is where every time you want to know how to use the system, you can come in here, ask questions. We have teams that are listening and will answer your question with examples and screenshots to the best of our ability. Also here, if you go to our support site, this is support@k2view.com. So you can get to the community. This is where we were just at. You can get to our academy. This is where you get trained on our products. And you can get to our knowledge base. Of course, if you have an issue, you have an actual error or bug, you can report a problem through our ticketing system. But in the knowledge base, this is where everything about the product is provided and detailed and explained. Our topic today is Graphit, so I'm simply going to search for Graphit, and I will go to the Graphit overview section, and it explains in great details what is Graphit, how to use it. It even provides examples for every attribute and every object. We will learn today about the nodes and the properties and the attributes and many, many other things in a few minutes. Know that every one of those things that I'm showing you has an example in the support side of how to use it. Verbiage on how to use it, but also screenshots that will show you how this functionality is used. So again, simply go to support.k2view.com, search for whatever it is you want to understand, and it will take you there. Okay, now let's go back to our designer, our studio, and introduce you to the environment that we're in right now. We mentioned that K2view create this layer on top of all the source system, and it integrates and aggregates and consolidates all this information and creates business manifestation of the data, something that we call logical units. In our product tool environment, our logical unit is a customer. And what you're seeing right now here on the screen, this is the definition of what a customer looks like in K2view. And you might be able to see that we collected information from CRM about that customer. These are all tables and objects in CRM. And CRM might be, in our example, a DB2 environment. We collected a billing environment information that has different tables or different objects. Let's say this is Snowflake. And more system and more technologies into this one location where all the data is integrated into. So we've created the schema. By the way, there will be other developer community meetups when we talk about a lot of this functionality. For the context of our today, we assume that we've already integrated all this data. This data now sits in K2view. And now we want to expose this data using web services. So for those who are familiar with our desktop version, you probably know that you can go to web services and you can create Java web services if you wish to write code, or you can create graphical web services by right-clicking. You can also look at it in the menu and create web services. But in the web version, in the Web Studio, there is also the ability to use command palette. Command-Shift-P, I will use it moving forward. And this essentially allows me to search for whatever functionality I want to do in the studio. Instead of navigating the tree or the menu and figure out what I want to do and where I want to do it, you can simply do it with the command palette by typing in the command that you want to use, and it will automatically get you there. Now, in our case, I type web service. So it asks me, do you want to create a Java web service? And again, the functionality is still there. All the functionality that exists in the desktop version exists here as well. And if you wanted to develop it using Java, the Web Studio has all the debugging functionality built into it with the ability to do breakpoints and step in and step out and run and everything that you are familiar with. But in our case, we want to focus on the business-oriented definition of a web service. So I'm going to use the Graphit module. And it's going to ask me, where do you want to create this new Graphit? And I'm going to say that I want to create it under a new category that we're going to call Meetup. And what is the name of the Graphit interface or Graphit web service that I want to define? Let's call it Get Customer Info. And I click the Enter button or the return. And it automatically added a section called Meetup under Web Services, and it automatically created my Graphit in here. Now, we have our first Graphit open. Let's understand a little bit the lay of the land, how to use Graphit. So we mentioned that Graphit is a graphical web service designer. The idea is to use little to no code in order to build complex formats of web services. And the star of the show is this line here that we call a node. A node in Graphit correlates to an element in the output of the web service. So if I click, for example, this plus button to the left of the node, it creates what's called a sibling node. You can see we have two nodes. Each one will correlate to an object in the output of the web service. But because they're in the same level, they're in the same hierarchy, they will be in the same level in the output of the web service. If I click this arrow here and I create what's called a child node, then we will see a parent-child relationship in the output of the web service. And what's really nice about it, that it's all drag and drop, like I can move things around very efficiently, and now both of these nodes will be under this parent in the output of the web service. Now, a node is comprised out of a few elements, comprised out of the name. This is where I type in the name of the node. This will correlate to what I see on the screen, the name that I put here. It's comprised of the node type or the operation that we want to execute. And we will go through most of these in our demo today. And it comprised out of the logic. What do you want to achieve in this node? There's also the ability to add a property to the node. This happens when I click this plus sign here. It opens the property pane, and I can select whichever property I want to apply on top of that node, and it helps with the configuration and definition of that node. So we're talking about a node that has a name, that has the node type, the operation that we want to do, that has the logic and has properties. A node also has some, standard delete, copy, and cut button. And when you click them, they perform the relevant activity. If I would click the copy, notice what happens. I now have two new buttons. One of them allows me to paste the copied element as a sibling, and the other one will paste it as a child. Just nuances of how we use the systems. Up here on top, you have a menu option, the first of which is the configuration tab. This is where, among other things, we can define inputs to the Graphit web service. Of course, we can create as many of those as we want. We'll see some examples in a second. We will decide if we want to expose this Graphit as an endpoint, as a web service that other consumers can call. We can also add a description to it. Let's learn about Graphit. We can also debug our work. You can see how your work looks like in a JSON object. You can see how it will look like in an XML, even a CSV file. And we'll get to that a little bit later on in the advanced section. You can also profile your work. So know exactly, very low granularity, how much each thing that I did in the Graphit took in terms of time, so I can maximize and tune my performance. Now that we're introduced to the layout, the look and feel, let's start working on data. Now, we want to consume information from our customer logical unit. So the first node that we will use is a node that helps us set the scope. Which logical unit do I want to connect and collect data? And what would be the instance, what would be the specific customer that I want to do to expose this on? Now, for those who are working on a little bit of older version of Graphit, you might be used to using the SQL node type and writing a command on top of Fabric that will get the customer that you want to interact with. SQL, as you can imagine from the name, because K2view at the end of the day, it's a database. And even here, you can see that we're looking at an object called schema. This is the schema inside the logical unit, and all of these are effectively tables inside the logical unit. SQL will be the way to interact with that data. And in older versions, you needed to write a Fabric command that would say, I want to work on the customer logical unit, and I want to work on customer number one. In newer version, there is a dedicated node type called get. And when you select it, it allows you to select the logical unit that you want to work on. And it does a couple of things. It automatically creates the command for you. It also automatically set up an input parameter to the Graphit web service that will define our customer. In this case, it says, in order to provide which customer I want to run this web service on, I will add it, and it did that automatically, as an input to the web service. You'll notice, and we'll use it quite a lot, that this is how you interact with variables inside Graphit. When you want a variable, you put it under $ and curly brackets. In this case, because it was added as an input to the web service, then the consumers that will call the web service will provide the customer ID that they want to see the response on. And when it comes to those parameters, of course, you can define the type, you can define the description, provide customer ID, you can define if it's mandatory or not. You can even provide a debug value. A debug value will be used when I'm developing the web service, the Graphit web service. And in this case, I'm saying, during my development, I want to work on customer number one. Okay, now that we set the scope, and we know that we're working on the customer, and for the purpose of debug, we're working on customer number one, let's start bringing the data. And again, to interact with the data, the most common way, and there are others, we'll show them later on, is to use a node type called SQL that will allow us to run a SQL on top of K2view as a database. Now, let's say that we want to bring the addresses for that customer. When I select a SQL, notice that there is a new pop-up here, a database icon, and when I click on it, it opens a module that we call Query Builder. It's a way to build SQL language without you needing to type it. And by default, it will run the command on top of Fabric, but the truth is that it doesn't need to. Theoretically, if you really wanted, you can build a web service on CRMDB. It's CRMDB, it's one of our interfaces. In this case, I think DB2. So by saying, I want to bring the addresses table, and maybe I want to just bring 5 so we can see it visually on the screen. Nice. I can even check my work here. Notice that the address table has customer ID column, address column, street, everything that you would expect in an address table. When I click the Add button, a couple of things have happened. First, it added the SQL for me instead of me needing to type it. It also added a property called Session Provider that shows me that this query is executed on the CRMDB. And lastly, it gave me this pop-up that asks me, do I want to automatically set up the structure of the result in your web service? And by clicking yes, notice what happened. It brought all the fields in my query and placed them as child fields of the address request. The node type field is simply that. It's a field that is returned from the command above it. So believe it or not, we already have a web service working. In fact, if I now try to simulate this in JSON, you'll see that I'm getting a response back. These are the 5 addresses that he responded. Now, it's not very attractive, so let's add a new property called nice and set it to true. You can see it's added here, and click the refresh button, and now I'm seeing the result more visually. Most consumers, they don't care about the look and feel of the web service because it's a system that calls the web service and automatically uses the response. But if you do want to present it in a pretty manner, the nice attributes does that. And now we can see here is address number 146 and address number 147. And if I want to see the result back as an XML, I just click the XML button. There's no coding associated with that. I don't need to define how to code to expose it in XML or in JSON or in CSV. The system does that automatically for us. Now, we are not here to build web services on top of the source system. In a bit, we will talk about why this is not a very applicable approach. But we are here to build web services on top of Fabric. So I will delete this node here. And now I will bring another node from Fabric. Now, I could go here and do SQL and click this button and go to Fabric, and here's my customer logical unit and my tables and my columns and et cetera, et cetera. But there is another way of doing it in the new studio, in the web studio, and that's by going directly to the DB Interface Explorer. This shows me all the connections, all the interfaces that the platform currently has. So it has a connection to the DB2, the CRM, it has a connection to the billing, the asset. It also has one for Fabric itself. And here I can see the customer logical unit, and I can see the tables. And let's say I want to bring the customer information. I can see the columns. I can even select the individual columns that I want to bring. Let's bring the customer ID, the ID number, which is the social security number, first, last name, primary, phone, and occupation. And I'll simply right-click. And when I right-click, the context of the right-click menu changes depending on what's open here on the screen. So if I were to have the schema open where I define the tables and the object in K2view, right-clicking here would ask me if I want to add a table to the schema. But when I'm in Graphit, right-click here would allow me to add a node of a type SQL. And I can do that, and it will just add the node, or I can even right-click and add a node with all the fields, something that we've seen before. Now, I already have a web service working on top of Fabric. And again, this is not very appealing, so let's add the property nice again and refresh. And here's the result back. as a JSON, here's the result back as an XML, and here's the result back as a CSV. Again, no code changes here. Now, we notice here that the session provider property that in our case points to Fabric, but before point to CRMDB, the truth is that Fabric is its default behavior. So I don't necessarily need to include it. Having it pointing to Fabric or not having it at all will amount to the exact same thing. Another thing that I see here is that because the query is expecting to bring multiple results back, multiple rows, the results are shown as an array. Now, in our case, since we are working on a logical unit, the instantiation of one, customer number one, I know that in K2view, I will only get one customer back. So if I want to see this not as an array, but as an object, I can add another property called one and set it to true. And that tells the Graphit that I'm returning only one row back. Now here is our first example. We are seeing the customer ID, we're seeing the ID, a number, which is the social security, we're seeing first name and last name. Her name is Tali Griffin. And as I mentioned, it's all drag and drop type of functionality. So if I wanted to put first name and last name under maybe a name node, so below the ID number, I can go to the ID number, add a sibling node, call it name, and drag and drop first name and last name under the name. And now look what happened to the output. It created a new object called name that has first name and last name under it. And the same thing will be applied in XML, of course. So it's very easy and very intuitive to create a very complex structure simply by dragging and dropping some elements. And by the way, the node type is exactly that. It just says there's no logic to it. I just want to present it on the screen. Now, what would have happened if I wanted to manipulate the data a little bit? So sometimes, even though most of the work here is no code at all, sometimes you might want to include a little bit of code. And when you do, you have a variety of ways of doing it. The simple option is to use a node type called function. And function allows me to essentially create JavaScript code. Every JavaScript that you can imagine. In this case, I'm going to concatenate first name with last name. And I don't really need these two nodes anymore because I'm using their data here. So clicking the refresh button, here's now we have the name object and it concatenates first and last name Tali Griffin. Now, there are much more effective ways to manipulate the data. We'll talk about them later on in the presentation. But if you wanted to write code and any type of code that you wanted, you could do it through this function, which is the JavaScript option. Now, another very useful and very common node type is string. String, as you can imagine, allows you to write string. So if we had the phone number before, now it's just the string that I want to write. And string can utilize variables inside Graphit. So if I wanted to include the first name, I just put it, as we talked about before, in dollar and curly bracket. And now I added a +1 to indicate that this is a US number. So again, everywhere that you want to use a variable, you use a dollar curly bracket. The only exception to that is when you write JavaScript, when you write code, and in this case, we just directly refer to the element. Okay, so we brought in some basic information. We saw already a few node type and a few tags. Let's start enriching the data and add invoice information. This is where creating a Graphit or web service on top of K2view starts showing differentiators, because customer information was brought from CRM, that is DB2. The invoice that I want to bring is being brought from billing. That might be Snowflake, completely different technology, completely different system. But because everything is integrated into our platform, it now becomes very straightforward to do it. So again, I could have added a node of type SQL. You guys know the drill. And I can also use the DB Internet Explorer, which hold preferred in most cases. Now, when the screen starts getting clouded because there's a lot of nodes, you have the ability to collapse any parents. You can see here, this node is the parent of all these child. So by clicking on these 6 dots here, I essentially collapse all these sections. You can see there's a small plus button here, and that makes it very easy to move entire sections. So if I want to add the invoices, and let's add invoice, due date, status, and balance, and right click and add them as fields. And I want to move this section around, I can simply collapse, move it around. I can even move it to be under the customer. That's how simple it is to move and realign the structure. So now our API is including invoice information. So under my customer, because it's a child of the customer, I'm seeing all the invoices, and naturally we have several invoices that customer has. Now, when we look at it in JSON, we see that it looks good because JSON has these objects and an array of objects, but XML presents the data slightly different. Here's the invoice, and instead of having objects in XML, we have entries. That's how XML is configured. So Graphit gives you a very easy mechanism in order to rename and align and change this type of definition. First, it's not an invoice, it's invoices. We have plenty of them. So let's change the name and add an S. And second, we know that each entry here represents an invoice. So let's add a new attribute or a new property called entry tab. And this one will be a single invoice. By the way, we know that session provider fabric is not needed, so I'm going to take it off, so give us a little bit more space. So now under the invoices, I have a property called entry tag that is an invoice. And now every entry will be named invoice. Another very common thing in XMLs are attributes. And attributes can easily be added. If I wanted to define invoice ID as an attribute, I will simply select the property pane for invoice. I will select attribute equals true. I will click the reload or refresh. And now notice that invoice ID in XML is an attribute of the invoice entry. In JSON, because there is no concept of attribute in JSON, it just shows as a regular object. In XML, it's now an attribute. There's also the ability to define that certain nodes are only applicable to certain formats. For example, let's take the status and add a format property that says that it only belongs to XML. If I refresh, I see it here between due date and balance in XML. But if I look at it from a JSON perspective, it's gone. And this enables us to add definitions that are only applicable to XMLs. For example, XML has this concept called declaration. You see it in a lot of XML, this row at the top that declares what this file will, all sorts of configuration about that file. I can do that if in this case, we want it to be at the top. You see where it is in the file, it's on top of everything. So I'm going to scroll all the way up. I'm going to add a node above customer. I'm going to make it type row. Row is a node type that simply says don't parse, present it as is. And I'm going to add a format called XML. And now when I click the refresh button, in JSON, I don't see the declaration. Invoice is a regular tab. I don't see the status. In XML, I see the declaration on top, and I see the invoice as an attribute, and I see the status tab. Okay, we already learned quite a lot. Let's introduce a few more nodes. Let's say that I wanted to add into the invoice section more column and enrich the data depending on how big the balance is. I want to add new information if the balance is bigger than 1. So I can simply create a new node here, type condition. And condition also allows me to write JavaScript code. And in fact, you can write whatever code you want here. At the end, the response of that code should be either true or false. If it's true, then the first row, the child first row will be executed. If it's false, the second child row will be executed. So in this case, if the balance is bigger than 1, I can add a node here that says true. It's bigger than 1. And if it's not, I will add a node here that says false. And now we can refresh. And for invoice number 1, balance of 0.3 is below 1, so big balance equals false. For invoice number 2, balance is above 1, so big balance equals true. But I'm not limited to just one entry. I can actually add as many as I want. If I wanted to add more under the condition, I simply use a node type group. And group allow me to group multiple nodes together. So in this case, since we know that this first section of the group is bigger than 1, I will add something like big by. How much is it bigger by? And I know that it's bigger than 1, so I'm simply going to do something as simple as whatever the balance is minus 1. And if it's smaller, I will do the opposite. Now, instead of having to manually write all this entire section, I'm just going to copy it. We've seen this functionality. So I copy and I paste it as a sibling. And now the first group will be in case the balance is bigger than 1. And the second will be if it's smaller than 1. And in this case, I just do 1 minus. And by the way, I can also change the name, small by. So now when I refresh, for invoice number 1, the balance is 0.3 below 1, so big balance is false, and it's small by 0.7. For invoice number 2, because it's bigger, I get a different object. It says big by here instead of the small by that comes from here. So you can create completely different structures by utilizing this functionality. Okay, so we talked about condition. If I scroll down a little bit here, let's see if we can find it. There might be some nodes here, for example, invoice number 12. You see that the big by is showing a lengthy number. That's very common. Sometimes the numbers are very large and they have a lot of digits. So there are very simple ways to format numbers using Graphit. Since this is coming in the big by section, I'm just going to add a new property. This type is called number formatting. Generally speaking, wherever you use a property, the definition for the property are down here below. There's usually some predefined structure, but if you wanted to create your own structure, the definition of how to do it is here. And in this case, I'm going to add this structure that essentially says, I want to have at least 1 digit to the left of the point. Even if there isn't a digit, I'm going to add a 0. And I'm going to round it to 2 numbers to the right of the point. And by doing so, and obviously I would probably useful to add that to the small by. We had it in invoice 12. So now if we scroll down a little bit, or a lot, we'll be able to see that none of these entries have a lengthy format. The format automatically was adjusted. It was rounded. Another very popular column that is often formatted is a date. So here, if I go back up here, I'm going to minimize the whole condition to give us a little bit more screen. We can see that there is a column called due date that has this format. I can very easily change the format by adding a property. There are predefined formats that I can choose from, or down here below, there is definition of how I might define my own format. Month, day, hours, minute, second. And if before we had hyphens and we had milliseconds, now the format had changed to whatever structure I defined it. By the way, even changing time zone is just another property. Let me copy this one, paste it as a sibling. And let's say we want the time in Chicago. Okay. So I can simply add a time zone property. And by doing so, I automatically change the time. Now, K2view by default, because it integrates data from many, many systems and many applications, and those systems can be in different time zones, when we bring the data in, we transform it to UTC or GMT0. We always work on the same time zone so we can compare between values. But when you expose it, you can change it to any time zone that you want. So the time for this invoice in UTC is 11. In Chicago, because it's 5 hours behind, it's 6. So it's very, very straightforward to manipulate data as well. Let's add another section to underneath the invoice of the payments. You guys know the drill. Click the plus button, add a SQL. Let's call this payments. I'll click the query builder icon. I'll go to the customer logical unit. I'll look at payments, and I can even debug it here and see that customer number 1 has 7 payments. These are all the payments. And I'll click the add button, and I'll include the fields. That was a little fast, but you guys have seen that before. Now, if I just click the play button, I'm getting an incorrect result back. Because essentially under invoice number 1, I have a section called payment with all the payments, including payments that belong to invoice ID number 1 and payments that do not belong to invoice ID number 1. So how can I create this association? Since we know that there is an invoice column in payment and we know that we're under invoice number 1, we can simply add this creation by referring to the variable, curly brackets and $sign. Now, whenever you do, it always looks at the value above. So this invoice ID variable actually is coming from the invoice section. And by doing so, simply by adding this constraint, now I only see the invoices that belong to us. Payment 1 belonged to invoice 1 that is under invoice 1. And payment 2 did not have any invoices or payments, sorry, so it's empty. Now, this brings up something that is I know a lot of you have asked about in the past. When you look at the node type, there's an entry for SQL and then there's an entry for SQL non-prepared. For those who are more familiar with how SQL and database works, there is this prepare and binding functionality that is all around improving performance. Essentially, prepare in advance the plan that this SQL will be executed based on in allocated space that this variable will be populated in. And long story short, it's just a lot faster to use this. Now, in cases that you don't want to use prepare and binding, or in cases where you maybe concatenate and building this query by yourself, you can use SQL non-prepared. And in our case, it will give us the exact same results. Moral of the story is when you can use SQL, use SQL. It's always preferred. Okay, now we've seen before that if we look at XML, we've fixed the entry and the attributes. Now we might have the same problem with payments. So let's do that very quickly. Entry tag will be payment. The invoice ID we don't even need anymore because we're under the invoice. So we'll delete it. We'll include the payment ID as an attribute. Refresh. Now this looks a lot better. Now, we see here that for invoice number 1, because it has a payments, there is the payment section, but invoice number 2 doesn't have a payment. And maybe I don't want to present payments as an empty array if it doesn't exist. So turns out there's a very simple solution for that as well. All I need to do is go to payment, add an attribute of a property called show empty, set it to be false. And now when I refresh, invoice number 1 will show the invoice payments. Invoice number 2 doesn't have it, so there's no payment. We talked in the past that when you want to write code, Let me minimize this invoice section. When you want to write code, you have the ability to choose a node type function and write JavaScript, but the truth is that there is a much better way of interacting with data. K2view generally, when it wants to manipulate and process data, uses a module that we call Broadway. It's called Broadway after the Broadway show in New York. Here's the one Broadway that is responsible to mask a social security number. It's the reason why it's called Broadway, because each one of these vertical lines here, it's like a stage on a Broadway show. And on the stage, you have actors. These are these blue items that are performing an activity. So it's about transforming data with drag and drop business-oriented functionality. As with everything else in K2view, we try to limit the code to as much as possible. And you can see that the input for the Broadway has two values: the value, the social security that we want to mask, and another one that says if we want to mask it consistently or non-consistently. And the output is an attribute called result that simply results the mask value. And here it goes through all the transformation from the input parameter. Here we trim the values all the way through how we expose the information back, which is the new mask social security number. So now that we know that we have this Broadway, I can use it here. If I wanted to mask this social security number, and by the way, let's call it social security number because it really is, it's not an ID number, it's a social security number. I can add a new node of type Broadway, and I can select this K2 or mask social security that we've just seen, and it automatically adds the command for me with all the input parameter and the output parameters. So in this case, I want it to be consistent, so it's not inconsistent, and I want to mask the ID number. That's how we interact with variable, and I want to store the result. So I can create a new node here called mask SSN. And use the result that I stored. So now I have a new column called mask SSN that utilize Broadway in order to manipulate the data. In fact, every time I click this refresh button, notice that it will run through this process in order to mask the data. The original social security ended in 566. This is the input to my Broadway. The output is something that ends in 070. Here is my output. We finished and built what is a very complex structured Graphit or web service in a few clicks of drag and drop in the button. That was very, very quick. Now, let's expose it to the outside world. Let's make it into a web service. As you can see, I turned off the expose as endpoint. That means that at this point in time, it's not really exposed. In fact, if I'll go to our built-in integration with Swagger, and most of you know Swagger, it's a standard way to document web services, so other consuming application can read that format and automatically understand what are the web service, what are the endpoints, what are the inputs, what are the outputs. And in our case, we know that we created this Graphit under a category called Meetup. And that's what I would expect to see here. An entry, a category called Meetup, and underneath our web service. Now we haven't exposed it, so we're not seeing it here. And really all I need to do is click this button, verify that my web service still works. And now go back to Swagger, refresh, and here's our web service. By the way, this is now exposed to the outside world. You see here's the description of the web service, the description of the column. I can provide customer number one. I can see the result to customer number one. I can change the structure to be XML. I can run it. Very, very straightforward and simple. Now, it's not very common, though, to expose web service in this format. It's much more tradition now to expose as RESTful format. And the definition here allows me to configure and override how will my web service be exposed. For example, I can say that I want it to be under a path called Meetup. Customer will bring in the customer ID from the parameter, and we'll say info. And this will override my path. Now, another variable that is very, very common is the ability to change the verb. okay? So if I wanted to change the verb, it turns out that all I need to do is change the naming convention of the web service. In fact, I can go here and I can change it, rename the format. Let's add a version, the v1, and I only want to expose it as a get verb. And now I will only see get information instead of what we've seen before, that is both get and post. Okay, so if I go back here and I refresh, not only do I see the new structure, but I only see get. And if I wanted to create different versions, I can just duplicate my file, give it a different version. Now we have the same file appearing twice as version 1 and version 2, going into version 2, and simply make changes to the format that I want. In this case, let's say that we want everything that is under the invoices off. I can delete the entire section, or I can maybe add a property called enabled equals false that is very useful for the purpose of debugging. It helps me ignore stuff in the web service without needing to manually delete it. And here is our structure of a new web service. So now, if I go to this web service in version 2, I see the output as defined in version 2. If I want to see it in version 1, here's the result back in version 1. Here I'm presenting the result for customer number 1 in version 1 in JSON. I wanted to change it to XML, simply change the format. It becomes very, very straightforward to configure. If I wanted to bring data for customer number 2, here's customer number 2, here's customer number 2 in JSON, and here's customer number 2 in version 2. I'm just presenting these links and sites that are very helpful that we've seen in the beginning of the meetup. And if you guys want to ask questions, feel free to unmute yourself. If not, Adi, there might be some questions in the Q&A that you can bring up for me.
How flexible is it to convert Graphit to Java code or Java web service code to Graphit?
So the truth is that it's not complicated. In fact, meaning you can interact from Java into Graphit. I think here I might have created an example of actual Java code. I'm not really a developer, so for me it's a little bit harder to do that. But here's me writing Java code and interacting with Graphit directly. The truth is that you don't really need to. It's so intuitive to use Graphit, and even if you invested in your Java code, first, all the functionality still operates in any of our versions. We're always backward compatible. And usually creating the same in Graphit, as you see, we built a very complicated web service in 20 minutes or so by dragging and dropping objects. So that's also applicable. We were talking about the different versions and the ability to impact the verb simply by using the naming convention. And we're looking at an example calling from an outside that I can change the format from JSON to XML. I can change the customer that I want to run it on, and I can change the version without needing to do any coding. It's as simple as applying it on the format on the URI. Now, let's go back to version number 1, and let's go back to JSON. And let's look at customer number 5. Customer number 5 was never actually brought into K2view before. It exists in the source system, but it was never brought into K2view. So the question might come up, what happens if I'm going to try and run it on customer number 5? And the truth is that the way that K2view works is that if the data doesn't exist, we will go and retrieve it from the source system and integrate and aggregate and do all this complex data transformation and present it on the screen. And you can see that it came back instantly because K2view operates on these logical units. We do not go and say, bring me all 100 million customers, we just say, bring me the subset of data that belongs to customer number 5 from the different system. So I ran an API on a customer that did not exist, and it came back instantly. Now, I'm running this API from the Chrome that I'm using to do the development. So in reality, the credentials and the permissions that are used to run this API are the ones that I use to log in to the studio, because K2view support sessions and cookies and JWT and tokens and basic authentication. There's many forms of how to authenticate. If I take this API and I run it externally, let's say from something like Postman, which is a very common tool to work with APIs, you can see that I naturally get a response that I'm not authenticated to run, right? Security is a very important part in K2view. So if I wanted to enable people to run it externally, I can do one of two things. I can go to our administrator module. This is not the context of this discussion, so we're just going to show you, but we're not going to actually define that right now. And I create new roles and new user and new permissions, and the permissions can be as granular as who has permission to run what version and what verb and what data, and very, very fine-grained security definition to define whether you're allowed to run. But even if you wanted to expose it to the entire world without permission, you can do that. You can remove the required authentication from this individual Graphit. Now, that means that the person executed is not authenticated, and we don't just give data or access to data without giving the right permission to access information about the customer or to execute Broadway. These are permissions that I can enrich the Graphit definition to say, I'm giving this Graphit permission to run a read on the customer and to run Broadway information. So now, essentially, I'm saying nobody needs to authenticate. If I go back to Postman and I click the send button, here I get the response back. Now, I only gave permission to execute on version 1. So I can look at customer number 1, and I can look at the data that belongs to customer number 2, and etc. But if I want to try and use it on version number 2, I still get the authentication failed. It's a granular type of security requirement, and you can define exactly who has permission to run what API. Now, if we're talking about security, the truth is that Graphit is automatically integrated to our platform security layer. And one of the features that was introduced, I think, last year was the ability to define, let me give back the permission here, to define what we call security profile. And security profile is a way to associate what people are allowed to see. When somebody is calling the API, are they allowed to see the data? Maybe they can see null instead of some data. Maybe they see stars or mask information. Maybe they see the real information. And in this case, I created a profile called secured profile, and I associated all sorts of security definition on it. So if somebody is calling this API that is not associated with that role, he sees the real information. Customer number 1, her name is Tali Griffin. If somebody calls it that is associated with that security profile, then they will see a mask information. Let me go back here for a second. Just make sure that I did required permission. And I'm looking in version number 1. Okay, so look what happened in the response now. If you remember, her name was Tali Griffin. This is the response that I get to the exact same web service when I'm calling with permission. When I'm calling without permission, I'm getting masked information. Her name here is Cynthia Barlow. It's the same customer number 1, same invoices, payments, but her name was masked. Her phone number was masked from 733 to 925. Her occupation was masked. She was a nurse practitioner. She's now a hairdresser. Even our social security was masked, every PII information. In fact, you can see that her original number was 566 and her masked social security is 070. In the unsecured API, in the secured API, the masked social security is appearing as the original value. So when we were showing this example of how to mask data via Broadway, the truth is that you don't even need to do this type of masking because K2view has this built-in integration and security layer that essentially says, depending on who's calling, you might get real data, you might get fake data or masked data, you might not see some of the data altogether. Okay, let's go back to our API. And again, we know that we can run it on customer number 1 and customer number 2. And we've seen that even if the customer doesn't exist, you can run it, doesn't exist in K2view, you can still run it and get a response back. But what happens if I want to run on a customer that doesn't even exist in the source system? Let's say 2000. Obviously, I would get an error back. It says customer 2000 doesn't exist. There's nowhere to collect this information on. Now, the structure of the error that we're getting here, this is a structure that we can control. In fact, if I go back to our studio and I right-click Graphit, you see that on top of creating a regular Graphit, I can also create a Graphit of type error handler. And it turns out that simply by defining a Graphit that is named error.graphit, every error or every issue that when you call a web service or a Graphit that happens will present the response in this format that I defined here. So I have the status and the messages and the path and the method. These are all definitions that we get from the error that is happening. And I created a section here called header and put all the header variable underneath it. And this correlates to how the data is presented on the screen. Status, messages, path, method, here, all the headers that I collected. Every bit of information is available for you from this error.graphit in order to decide what to do and how to present the result. I even here noticed that status equals 500. And for the purpose of examples, I added a condition node. It says status 500. And here, if it's really 500, I'm changing the status to 200. And I'm adding an entry to the header called K2view Graphit dev commit. So if I go back here and I look behind the scenes, I run it, I can see that the response type was changed to 200. And in the header, I included a new entry, K2view Graphit dev meetup. So it becomes very simple to standardize the way errors are presented in web services in K2view simply by creating a Graphit called error.graphit and defining how you want the format to be. Okay, one last subject that we want to cover. We spent a lot of time talking about Graphit as a way to create web services and expose data. The truth, though, that you don't have to use Graphit for web services. Graphit can be used every time you want to create complex JSON, XML, or CSV format. In fact, you can call Graphit from other elements in K2view when you're trying to do data transformation, when you're trying to do data pipeline, when you're trying to move data. Here I created a Broadway. If you remember, Broadway is the tool that we use to manipulate and handle data. And this Broadway utilized Graphit in order to create structure. So here you can see, and I'm just going to explain it as we run it. This Broadway is simple. I'm selecting a list of customers from CRMDB. This is our DB2 environment. And in this case, I think we're only bringing 2 for the purpose of the meetup for the example. And for each one of them, I'm creating the Graphit file. This is the same Graphit that we've just created. I'm using it in a data transformation or data pipeline. And then I'm going to take this file and I'm going to write it here under this project resources that this is where the files will be added. So as with anything else in K2view, everything is business oriented. Even debugging is visual. So instead of just clicking the play button and running it, I'm going to click the debug step, and I'm going to walk step by step through this Broadway. Notice where my error is. This is where I am right now. The first actor will retrieve a list of 2 customers, customer number 1 and 2. Now we're getting into a loop, an iteration. For each one of these customers, we're going to call the Graphit. Right now we're working on customer number 1. So here is the Graphit that we've created for customer number 1. And it also creates a text that will represent the name of the file that I will create. I will create a file called Graphit_1, customer number 1.json. And now I'm going to write it to this location here. So as soon as I click the play next button, the Graphit file was created here. Now I'm just going to click the play next, so you'll keep running and create the second Graphit. And this is how simple it is to now create complicated structures. Here's Graphit number 1, and here's Graphit number 2. Simply by utilizing it, I can create very complex and advanced formats when I do data movement, data pipelining, and I can even use it inside K2view. So up until now, we created a web service, a Graphit web service, and every time you call it, it runs all this functionality. Still very, very quick sub-second performance, but maybe the data doesn't change very often, or maybe you want to save this structure inside your logical unit. And here, I created a table called customer info that will actually run as part of extracting data from the source system. You will run this Graphit that we have created and will store the result inside a table inside the logical unit. Again, all I'm doing is calling the Graphit file. It's as simple as that. So let's run it on customer number 1. Again, everything debug is, is visually oriented, and we're running it and we're seeing how the data flows. Customer number 1 coming into our API, that's our input. And then we get the same structure that we've created and we store it inside K2view. So now theoretically, you can even come here and say, instead of running the API that will calculate all of that, I built another API here that uses that pre-built column. It will go to that table and say, bring me the data from that column. Exact same structures, exact same format, but now I'm not calculating this in real time. Now I want to emphasize, Graphit is applicable to 99.109 after of the use case because it's extremely fast. But there are some cases where you want to store the format or the JSON, the XML that you created inside K2view, and that's a mechanism of doing it. By the way, if we are talking about performance, we mentioned at the beginning that there is a built-in profiler in the debug of Graphit. And this gives us the ability to see very fine-grained definition of how much every little thing took when we built this Graphit. How much time it took to run the select statement on Fabric, how much time it took to create the customer ID entry or the social security number, or how much each invoice took to run and how much each payment took to run, and very, very fine-grained definition. And that means that you can really maximize and tune your performance in a very effective way. You don't have to guess where the Graphit or the web service is running slow. You know exactly where it is by looking at that profiling definition. Really do appreciate, guys, you joining us, especially if you stayed for the duration of the meeting. This recording will be available on our website. It'll also be available on YouTube at one point. And we'll continue and having this discussion hopefully almost every month. We're going to try our best to create this monthly. And again, thank you all very, very much for being here with us today. Have a great day.